Hi, everybody. I'm going to introduce to you the part one of the population blended unit. I am going to do a couple of things, including, besides introducing part one, I'm going to explain the country statistics assignment, and then I'm going to explain to you terms that people use when discussing levels of development. In the part one assignment, which is in the blended unit on Canvas, before the part one assignment, you'll see there are student expectations that you should get very familiar with. Notice that there is a section on things, if something happens, what you should do. And also notice that there is a discussion of the points being used to grade all the different parts of this particular part. In the part itself, you'll see that there is a population pretest. So the first thing you should do is actually take this. This is a quick quiz, which is in Google Forms. You'll be operating from things you already think about population and development. Please don't look things up on the web. It's not graded, but the answers you give will be very useful in the next thing you do. And part two, you're going to use Edpuzzle to take a look at a video in which a really popular person who relates to population and development kind of explains what people think about population and development. In the Edpuzzle, it's actually inside Canvas. You'll need to answer questions as it goes through. And also, just as important, it's going to give you links to an interactive graph that you should try out every time we have a different break in the video. You're going to need to know how to use that interactive graph later in the blended unit. Once you have that finished, you'll need 3 copies of the country stats sheet handout, which looks like this. It's sideways there. I'll explain more in a second. In order to do that, you'll need to choose 3 countries, 1 from each column, from this particular chart of countries. So pick 1 from each of the columns. And when you do, please be sure to try to pick one that you know less about. So in fact, don't pick one that seems easy to you, that you already think you know about, so that by the time you get to part 4, you've actually become sort of an expert on at least a couple of the countries themselves. So once you select those countries, incidentally, you're going to need this particular population data sheet to fill out the country statistics sheets. Once you get them, they look like this. So you're just going to write the name of your country up here, its continent and region, and then use the statistics sheet to actually fill out the top right here. Do that for all 3 countries. And then for one of your sheets, you don't have to do this for every one because it's kind of redundant, complete the bottom. So when you're doing the bottom, you're going to take your 3 countries and compare them. You're going to compare their fertility, their rate of natural increase, their mortality. And what you'll find out is not just about the countries themselves, but you'll find out about how they actually relate to each other, which is very important to other parts of the unit. So that brings us to a quick discussion that'll be useful for you. How do people describe levels of development? So I'm going to explain how one particular set of terms that people use for levels of development is really no longer used, especially by serious academics or human geographers. I'll give you a couple other options, and then I'll show you the best terms to use when it comes to AP Human Geography. So I'll bet that more than a couple of you have heard people use any of these 3 phrases: first world, second world, or third world. These, even though they're still in use by some people today, were actually not really accurate even when they were used in the past. So this particular description of levels of development comes from the Cold War. So the Cold War, which began after the Second World War in 1945, was a system in the world in which there were, for the most part, only 2 superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. They were at ideological odds with each other, and because of that, they tended to try to collect allies for use against each other. The citizens of the United States tended to call themselves the First World. So when they described the United States and any of its allies, they obviously had very glowing terms about them. They thought that they were highly developed. They thought that they were technologically advanced, that they tended to be democratic, that they were capitalist, et cetera, et cetera. And those things were never all true for most of those countries. It's just something people wanted to believe. When Americans looked at the allies of the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union itself, they called that the Second World. So again, they kind of lumped a whole bunch of people together and kind of said they were the same. And that, of course, is never really true. When the United States looked at the countries of the world that had not taken a side, they called them the Third World. So the Third World was not officially on the side of the Soviets or of the United States. Those countries, in the minds of Americans, tended to be the least developed of all. Okay, so therefore, a third world became a phrase to describe countries that some people might even say were undeveloped in the world. The use of these phrases just doesn't make any sense anymore. It didn't make a lot of sense actually in the Cold War, and so it's not something we're definitely going to use in an educational setting. So people often tried to fix that by going with these three, that some countries in the world were developed, some were developing, and some were undeveloped. It's definitely an improvement, but there's two major problems. First of all, development is based on people's point of view. So Americans like to think that the rest of the world really wants to be us. There are people in the rest of the world who don't really want to be like the United States. So therefore, calling something developed can actually mean a lot of things, and we have to keep our minds open about that. If you call, however, a country undeveloped, that no longer describes really the vast majority of the planet. So it makes some sense to at least drop the undeveloped. Most of the rest of the planet tends to be developing, some slower than other places. And as I said before, in some cases, the people who are developing slowly don't really want to develop fast. Okay, so it's really based on point of view. So geographers were unhappy with most of these. So in AP Human Geography, we tend to subscribe to a model called World Systems Theory. And in World Systems Theory, they use these three words. So core, semi-periphery, and periphery can solve a lot of problems for AP Human Geographers because it's not really about development. So we're not going to use the word developing or developed when we describe these countries. Instead, this is based on how connected countries are together. It is true that if a country is highly connected to the rest of the world, it usually is considered developed. But because this is based more on fact than opinion, it's basically a better system. So we have the core. Core countries are far more connected to the rest of the world than semi-periphery or periphery countries are. And as you can probably guess, the United States, Japan, Germany, these are all core countries. Periphery countries on the other end of the spectrum tend to be far less connected to the rest of the world, and these are countries like Afghanistan or Guatemala or Niger. Of course, then there's a whole bunch of countries in between, the semi-periphery, and as with almost anything you learn about in human geography, there is no cutoff between these. So there are countries that, based on some things, might be seen as more semi-periphery. Based on other things, they might be seen as core. So we're going to practice using these terms some more, but just so you know, these will be very useful in what you do in the rest of the unit. So my conclusion for this screencast is, number one, be sure to save your country statistics sheets for use later in the unit once you finish them. Two, remember how the quiz at the beginning of the unit showed some flaws in how people view population statistics. Number three, remember the appropriate terms for discussing levels of development.